Hello and welcome back to Foreign Correspondents. I'm Somi Sorang, and joining me here in the studio today is our panel of foreign journalists. Welcome to the program.
Hello, thank you.
Recent media reports indicate that North Korea's nuclear program is still moving ahead and that the regime could be reassembling its missile testing sites, raising skepticism on whether the regime is sincere in its will to denuclearize. So on this week's edition of Foreign Correspondents, we sit down with our panel of foreign journalists to discuss what can be done to keep North Korea on the path of denuclearization. UN panel said on March 12th that North Korea's nuclear and missile programs, quote, remain intact, confirming these suspicions. So Fred, do you think that North Korea has fallen short of the international community's expectations regarding its progress on denuclearization?
Well, I'm not too sure. I don't think nobody should expect North Korea to give up everything they built for decades like this without anything in exchange. So of course they have not only Yeongbyeon, but they have other, like we know now, they have other like secret sites. I mean, the question is, in Hanoi summit, they discussed only Yeongbyeon, and of course the US wants to discuss more. But once again, I don't think we should expect them to give a full inventory and to suddenly open themselves completely while they have no guarantee and nothing in exchange. I wouldn't frame that as oh, they fell short of the expectation of the international community.
Do you feel the same way, Andrew?
Pretty largely. I mean, any negotiation is give and take, right? It's quid pro quo. The Americans seem to be asking for the end result, which is denuclearization, in advance of the process of a negotiation. So I think Moon Chang-in, who's the advisor to President Moon Jae-in, said it quite nicely the other day. The North Koreans want all for all. We want everything from you, everything for us, and we'll meet in the middle. Whereas the Americans are sort of offering an all or nothing deal. And that huge deal, that very, very big deal, which the Americans apparently wanted, was probably too big for one summit. And sure enough, the summit fell through.
Okay. Now, US President Donald Trump, he mentioned in a press conference in Hanoi following his summit with North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, he said that the US was watching North Korea's every move via satellite.
We know the country very well, believe it or not. We know every inch of that country, and they have shots from above, way above.
And Trump's national security advisor John Bolton said that Washington was closely monitoring North Korea's actions, quote, unblinkingly. So do you believe that the US, as it claims, has a full and complete picture of North Korea's nuclear infrastructure?
Well, it's probably safe to say that they know everything that you can see on satellite, right? So it's pretty easy. I mean, open source analysts can do this as well. You can pinpoint where all these sites are. I think Bolton and Trump might be overstating it a little bit. There's obviously probably a lot of facilities that go on underground, a lot of things they don't know about. But it's also important to say that North Korea's never committed to handing over a full inventory of all this stuff as well, right? North Korea's not even committed to specific steps on denuclearization yet. And during the summit, they promised, they essentially offered giving up Yeongbyeon, which is one of the biggest facilities. And then the Americans said, well, we know about other sites as well. But as Andrew said, it has to be the step-by-step approach, right? And you can't say, well, we know about everything, so give up everything right away, right?
Okay. Now, during the Hanoi summit, North Korea neither acknowledged or mentioned the existence of other nuclear sites aside from Yeongbyeon.
미국 측은 용변 지구 핵시설 폐기 조치 외에 한 가지를 더 해야 한다고 끝까지 주장했으며 따라서 미국이 우리의 제안을 수용할 준비가 되어 있지 않다는 것이 명백해져 있습니다.
Why did North Korea during the summit emphasize the Yeongbyeon facility or the dismantling of that site alone?
Well, we don't know necessarily what happened behind closed doors. You know, the North Koreans may very well have acknowledged the existence of some of these secret sites. I think Yeongbyeon is probably the most visible site. It's, as far as we can tell, according to some estimates, the most substantial site. I think there are probably different estimates. The Russians say it's not that important. Other analysts say it's very important. I think Yeongbyeon is also, if it was the symbol in 2008. They blew up one of the cooling towers, so it's something that the Americans know about. There's a long history of relations, of negotiations over that site. And I think the North Koreans probably thought that this was the American expectation, right? That was certainly our expectation going into the summit, was that they would trade Yeongbyeon for sanctions relief. It turns out we were right in guessing that that was what was going to happen, but we were wrong in assuming the Americans would accept it.
Right.
If I can add something, I totally agree with what you said. I think the North Korean mistake, what they did is that they thought that the US would accept to release most of the sanctions, because what they asked, they want a release of the sanction from 2016 and 2017, and that's actually the sanction that really hurt. And there is no way the US would accept to give so much in exchange of just Yeongbyeon, even though it's a very symbolic and still important site.
I would add that Yeongbyeon is sort of the crown jewel. That's their plutonium processing facility, which we've known about for decades. But this is not the first time an agreement has collapsed over their HEU, their highly enriched uranium programs, which, let's go back to the James Kelly visit in 2002, which essentially killed the agreed framework agreement, and that was over the secret HEU programs and facilities, which may or may not be connected to Yeongbyeon. So Yeongbyeon is on the table, but the HEU seems to be the deal breaker.
Right.
And this will be the second time a deal has been broken, if indeed this process does completely, fall down.
Now, following that no-deal summit in Hanoi, the US has oscillated between pressuring North Korea and also calling for dialogue. Despite its hardline stance, the US has emphasized that it's ready to continue talking to North Korea.
The President is 100% supportive of us remaining engaged diplomatically to try to achieve that goal. We are not going to do denuclearization incrementally. The President has been clear on that, and that is a position around which the U.S. government has complete unity.
Why do you think the U.S. is oscillating between pressure and dialogue?
Actually, I find that quite puzzling. A couple of weeks before the summit, we had Steve Biegun, one of the American negotiators, who seemed to favor a step-by-step approach. And I found that he made a speech, what did at Stanford? Yeah. That was extremely positive, and I was optimistic when I heard that speech. And a couple of weeks later, we see a completely the change of the American position. Now, as Andrew mentioned, they want a big deal. And I'm really wondering why. Is it because of internal pressure, like something happening in Washington? Why Bolton suddenly seems now to have the ear of the president? Is it because the US tried to now build some kind of negotiating leverage before the future discussion? I really don't know. It's difficult to answer that question.
Yeah, I would just add, it seems like Trump has pretty much admitted now publicly that domestic issues played a big role in his decision to call off the deal, right? He said, the Michael Cohen testimony, which was very damaging to him, essentially contributed. So I think there's a possibility that maybe the American negotiators were working with a degree of flexibility with the North Koreans, that when they arrived in Hanoi, Trump might have changed his mind. Bolton, we weren't expecting Bolton to even attend the summit because he was supposedly busy with ongoing events in Venezuela, and then at the last minute Bolton appeared and everyone went, this isn't gonna go well. I think Trump may have gotten spooked a little bit, and he thought that this was going to be some grand diplomatic victory, and he realized, I'm not going to risk it. There's too much going on at home. I'm just going to go home, forget about North Korea for a couple of months and just deal with everything else that's happening to him.
Yeah.
So amid all these reports of North Korea's clandestine nuclear activities, there are now worries that the regime could revert back to its dangerous game of brinkmanship. Regarding the possibility of a resumption in North Korea's nuclear and missile testing, though, many experts have given mixed opinion.
These were deliberate efforts by North Korea in response to the inconclusive results of the Hanoi summit to send a message to President Trump and the world.
I don't think it's necessarily North Korea's return to provocations. I don't think this should be taken as a sign that they're going to return to missile testing or nuclear testing.
How do you rate the possibility of North Korea resorting or resuming the tactic of brinkmanship?
I don't know, but pressure plus dialogue is a classic tactic. You have carrot, you have stick. This is the way people work. Good cop, bad cop. So you want two stances. It gives you negotiating flexibility. So will North Koreans take that approach as well? I think this is the big risk. because right now we seem to be in a dialogue process with lots of good moves, lots of good talks. I think if North Korea goes back to a brinksmanship option, particularly if it tests another missile, I think that's a red line, and I think that's extremely dangerous. I don't see that happening. All we're seeing is signs of fairly minimal activity at some missile sites. There's no indication they're about to test a missile that I know of.
Right.
So I think this is part of the game, the big chessboard, but I think this is pawn moves. Again.
I think if we were going to see North Korea return to this type of thing, we would have seen it already. North Korea normally reacts pretty quickly to these types of things. If North Korea saw the deal collapse and went, right, we're going back to this strategy of tension, I think they might have already come out with it. I mean, to some extent, this activity at these testing sites is a degree of pressure because they know that the Americans are watching. And they know that people can say, oh, look, this activity is going on. Is North Korea going to test a missile? That's perhaps their way of saying to Washington, look, we can do this again, right? Because one of the things that Trump talked about most was that how much he appreciates there not being any missile tests, right? And the North Koreans can go, oh, we can finish, we can stop anytime, you know. So maybe that's part of the strategy as well.
Okay. Let's now move on to the topic of whether North Korea is willing to denuclearize at all, because an air of skepticism is growing regarding North Korea's sincerity in its pledge to denuclearize. In a recent survey of 1,000 South Koreans, 64% of the respondents said that they believe North Korea will never forfeit its nuclear program. So let me ask you the same question. Do you think North Korea will eventually give up its nuclear weapons?
I think right now, no, they will not denuclearize. But the question is not now. I think we should have a really long-term strategy, see like maybe a full decade away, and try to think, okay, why North Korea doesn't want to denuclearize now? Because they think they need the nuclear weapons for their survival. They look at Libya, they look at Iraq, and they think, okay, we need that to protect ourselves. So how do you change that? That's why you need to talk, you need to discuss, you need to find some measures to build trust, like opening liaison office. One of my biggest disappointments in Hanoi is that Trump and Kim Jong-un were unable to find like smaller agreement, like opening a liaison office. So we don't know exactly what North Korea will do, but it means that doesn't mean we should not try and try and try, because this is diplomacy. You fail until you succeed. I mean, for decades, the US was able to manage the Soviet Union threat. Why not do the same with North Korea?
Now let's talk about North Korea and its history with nuclear arms. Although North Korea conducted its first nuclear test in 2006, the regime has had a long-held interest in nuclear weapons, dating back to the years immediately following the Korean War. Why do you think North Korea has maintained or dedicated itself to developing nuclear arms throughout all these years?
I mean, that's a great question. Books have been written on that topic. You know, I think a lot of it started with the deployment of nuclear assets on the southern part of the peninsula by the Americans. I think a lot of it had roots in Kim Il-sung's desire to essentially preserve his legacy and protect the country's sovereignty as he saw it for well into the future. I think a lot of it had to do with Kim Jong-il's desire to survive no matter what. And I think now it's become something of a source of legitimacy for Kim Jong-un. You know, the years sort of 2016 to 2017 really saw him place a lot of his leadership on the success of the nuclear program and the missile program. I think now North Korea sees it as a tool for self-defense, but they also see it as a source of prestige for the country. They can say, look, we've overcome all these difficulties. You know, if you read the propaganda, you can say that the big line is that the people have suffered, but now we have this treasured sword of national defense, and now we can improve the people's lives because we have that security, right? Which again makes everyone more skeptical about North Korea's desire to give them up. But then again, North Korea is not a democratic country. If nuclear weapons are a source of legitimacy, they can change that at any point, and it can become about the economy, it can become about patriotism. So yeah, that's, I guess, my short answer.
I agree with you. I think the internal aspect is important too. And we should, I mean, we know that, but North Korea lost the competition with South Korea in economic term, in defense term. Nuclear now is the only thing they have, especially to defend themselves in terms of asymmetric capabilities.
Right. Okay.
So that won't be easy for them to give it up.
Right. Yeah. Why would they? I mean, if you're a very, very poor country with no relevance to international society whatsoever, politically, economically, culturally, what does North Korea have to offer the world that's of interest? But nuclear weapons give them a position not just at the negotiating table with the US president, but on the front pages of media like ours. It's a source of relevance for North Korea.
Okay, so staying with the issue of relevance and being recognized as a nuclear state, currently the Non-Proliferation Treaty, or NPT, officially recognizes 5 countries as nuclear weapon states, namely the US, the UK, Russia, France, and China. However, Israel, India, and Pakistan are also in possession of nuclear weapons as non-signatories of the treaty. And some have suggested that North Korea should also be recognized as a de facto nuclear state. How do you rate the possibility of North Korea being officially recognized as a potential nuclear state?
From everything that's gone, through this process thus far, precisely 0.
Okay.
My sense is that in the international community, particularly in the States, there's a real sense that North Korea is the red line for the NPT. If North Korea is allowed to move ahead with this program unimpeded and unhindered, this could be the green light for many another state around the world to do the same thing. And essentially the NPT, which as you say is not a perfect agreement, but has kept the nuclear Pandora inside its box since 1945, that situation could change radically. So I think North Korea finds itself in the unpleasant position of being a test case itself versus the international community with the future of the NPT as the prize for the international community.
And then the question is, if North Korea is recognized as a nuclear state, then the desire for South Korea to get its own nuclear arsenal as well becomes enormous, right? Like this was something that was talked about a lot in 2016, this possibility of South Korea, developing its own nuclear program, and Trump even suggested that he might be open to it on the campaign trail. I think if North Korea is recognized as a nuclear state, which I agree with Andrew, I think is very unlikely, I think the case for South Korea and Japan to nuclearize as well becomes, I think, very difficult to argue against.
Okay, let's now talk about some measures that could be used to encourage or pressure North Korea to stay on the path towards denuclearization. U.S. National Security Advisor John Bolton recently warned the regime that Washington could push for further sanctions on North Korea if it fails to denuclearize. Do you think the UN could introduce tougher sanctions on North Korea if it continues to forge ahead with its nuclear program?
Yes, I mean, last week the panel of experts on sanctions, the UN panel of experts showed that there is still a lot to be done in terms of implementation first. There is a lot of loopholes. Some countries, Oliver mentioned China, Russia, other countries actually do not implement as strictly as they should the sanctions. So there is definitely more things to be done, and I'm sure you can find even like stronger way to you can reduce some importation cap on oil. I mean, there is many things you can do to tighten the screws even more. In terms of incentivization, I think there might be a way to try to convince North Korea, like if they make some compromise, they could join some international organization. They could they have something to gain. And so I think as well the Moon Jae-in approach of trying to build economic ties, to somehow integrate a little bit the North Korean economy in the region, to develop leverage on North Korea is as well a good strategy. The problem is you cannot do both.
Do you think tightening UN sanctions, that is the right way to go, or should we focus more on incentivization?
Again, carrot and stick. You should be keep the pressure on, but offer a better future. I mean, I think my biggest disappointment with Hanoi was, frankly, I thought there was going to be some kind of agreement. I thought it was in both parties' interests to reach a deal. That didn't happen. They went for the big deal, but there were so many, as Oliver says, baby steps they could have taken. I mean, the Americans could offer an end-of-war declaration or even a peace treaty to end the Korean War, the opening of liaison offices in each other's capitals, the easing perhaps of some sanctions, maybe just for South Korea, for the Mount Gumgang, for the Kaesong complexes to reopen. There were so many things they could have put on the table, and as Fred says, to join certain international organizations, which in many cases they're already signatories to. but these steps weren't taken. So will they be taken in the near future? On the hopeful side, we could say now the two parties have got a clearer idea following Hanoi of their negotiating positions, which wasn't clear before because it was a hastily arranged and arguably not very well arranged summit. But whether this is going to happen, I don't know. So much depends on the US president. And as you say, he's got massive domestic problems. And I think he realizes now, a year after Singapore, that North Korea is not going to be an easy win.
Okay. Now, coming back to South Korea, the Unification Ministry said on March 12th that this whole government will continue to seek out a peace treaty and a formal declaration to end the Korean War, depending on North Korea's progress with denuclearization. Do you think we can still have an agreement on a peace treaty or a declaration to end the war, even with North Korea still going ahead with its nuclear program?
Well, that's an interesting shift on Seoul's part, because Seoul was originally saying that a peace treaty would be the first step towards denuclearization, that if you offer them a peace treaty, that would essentially amount to a security guarantee that the North Koreans want. You know, I still think it's possibly likely. I mean, it depends what you mean by continuing to develop its nuclear program as well, right? Like, if we see a North Korean nuclear test or a major missile test, I don't think it's likely. But if we see a continuation of these kind of low-level things that we've been seeing in the past couple of weeks, I think it's entirely possible, maybe at a third summit.
And how big of a carrot do you think this peace treaty is for North Korea to denuclearize?
I think it's not as big as some people say. I mean, we saw that in Hanoi. I think really for North Korea, what really matters now is are sanctions. Of course, but it's still an important card, and I think it still should be used. I agree with you. It's one of the important baby steps that you can use, and I really hope. I mean, I'm all in favor of a peace treaty. I think it would be a good thing to help to reduce the tensions.
Okay.
You know, I would add that a peace treaty is pretty easy for the Americans to do. You're not giving away much, right? And as we know from great treaties in history, Treaty of Versailles and the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ended World War I, they didn't last very long. We had World War II. So treaties can be broken, but, you know, temporarily they're a good thing. But secondly, it's an important incentive for North Korea because it offers Kim the opportunity to say to his generals and his hardliners, we now have a peace treaty with the Americans and the South Koreans, so we can start to disarm and really focus on our economy. So it does give Kim something pretty significant if he wants to use it.
Right. Okay. Now, time now for our last question. What can the Moon Jae-in administration do to break the current impasse between North Korea and the US?
I mean, it's becoming more and more difficult for the South Korean government. I mean, last year, Moon Jae-in played a mediating role quite brilliantly. He worked pretty well, but I think now, with the US hardening their position, it's more difficult. I think what the South Korean government can do is try to convince their American allies that going for the big deal is not the best approach, and really we should try a more realistic diplomacy. And on the other side, keep the dialogue with North Korea. I think it was good that they met 3 times. Kim Jong-un and Moon Jae-in met 3 times last year, and that was probably a good thing. So try to keep the dialogue with North Korea to tell them, don't do any provocation, and try to show them what kind of reward they would have in case they find a compromise and an agreement.
Yeah, I mean, it's increasingly difficult to think of what the administration here can do without some kind of split in the alliance, right? Because all of last year, South Korea's idea was that we're going to show North Korea what they can get if they take steps towards denuclearization. But now it seems like this US DPRK dialogue is stalling, but Seoul still wants to push ahead with Kumgang and Kaesong reopening. I think, I don't know, those things are good incentives for North Korea, but at the same time, if there's no progress on denuclearization, there's no sanctions relief, I'm not really sure what they can do.
A really, really tricky position now for South Korea to be in. But I'd agree with Fred. I think you've just got to push ahead and keep the dialogue channels open, keep doing what you can in the hope that things will get better.
So one thing that they can do is to keep the channels open, the channels of dialogue. Okay, we'll have to wrap it up there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you for your insight. During the Pyongyang-Washington summit in Hanoi, a journalist asked Kim Jong-un whether he was willing to denuclearize 2 to which the North Korean leader answered, "I wouldn't be here if I wasn't." We hope that he'll stay true to his words and earn the trust of the international community by maintaining goodwill. That's all we have for this week. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye.